Okay, so good evening everyone, and welcome to the LSI. So my name is Tim Crabtree. I'm a former trustee of the Literary Scientific Institute and a vague acquaintance of Rupert, and actually invited Rupert to come tonight, so I was asked to just make a very quick introduction. So when I arrived, Rupert said, "Oh, you haven't just read the Wikipedia entry about me," and I said, "No, I do know a little bit more, hopefully, than that." And so I wanted to say that I first came across Rupert's work when I was 19. I bought this book on morphogenetic resonance. Some of you might remember that book. I think it was called
A New Science of Life.
A New Science of Life. So that was my first introduction. And then some years later, I went to a Soil Association conference, and Rupert had been invited to come and give a talk. And after that, I bought this book, The Rebirth of Nature. And it might be something that we talk about a bit later, because I've done a lot of work in the areas around food and farming. And I'm very struck by the development of science around food and farming, and the way in which companies like Monsanto now are the main sponsors of scientific research in that area. What influence does that have on the kind of science that emerges from there? So there's that one. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, Rupert came and gave a talk at Thomas Hardy School, and my daughter, who was studying science at the time, went and was really struck by Rupert's talk, and afterwards bought his book, Science Set Free. And she said, "Why don't we talk about this at school? You know, we're given one particular line about science, and we never open up these questions, the kind of questions that are raised in this book." And she's now gone on, she's studying science at university. So that was another interesting sort of connection. And then the other connection that I have with Rupert is that I teach economics at a college, Schumacher College, linked to Plymouth University. And I was always struck when I studied economics, how economics has been kind of dominated by a kind of a science that it's brought in, which it's very clear now is a very out-of-date science, and it models the economy in completely the wrong way, and we can see the problems with that modelling right now. So I've always been interested in the kind of the influence of science on not just the natural sciences, but actually the way it then goes into other areas as well, and hopefully we can explore some of that this evening. And so just to end, about 7 years ago when I was teaching a course at Schumacher, one of my students, Amrita Bohai, she organised a TEDx series of talks over a day in Whitechapel, and this was during a 3-week course that I was facilitating. And Rupert was one of the speakers at this TEDx, and he gave a talk and then went away to India, and TED, this global organisation with an amazing reach, banned Rupert's talk, unbeknownst to Rupert because he was travelling in India. And this then caused an enormous furore, because the scientific committee of TED said that it wasn't appropriate for Rupert's talk to be put up online on TED, and yet TED is all about being open to ideas. And so, kind of unbeknownst to Rupert, this then opened up this enormous debate about the necessity for science being open to exploring new ideas. And it was wonderful to be working with this particular student as she had to respond to an initial onslaught, and then all this support that eventually came through to say, actually, we need to be open to new ideas. So that's my sort of connection with Rupert. So it's a real honour and pleasure to have been able to invite him to Bridport. I'm so glad that so many people were able to come. And I'm going to pass over to Rupert. Rupert's going to speak for about an hour, and then we'll have till about 9 o'clock for questions. And then if you want to join us afterwards for another drink and a book signing, that would also be great. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. It's a great pleasure to be here in this very beautiful part of the world, and great to learn that you have this wonderful institution here. I'm speaking this evening on the theme of the Science Delusion. It's the title of a book I wrote, which is in fact the same book as Tim's just mentioned. In America it's called Science Set Free. In Britain it's called The Science Delusion. My English publishers would only publish it on condition that I had that title, because their sales and marketing division had told them it would sell twice as many. Whereas the allusion to Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, was completely lost on people in America because he's not so well known there. And the American publishers wanted a positive title because Americans like positive titles, so that's why it's called Science Set Free. The subtitle of the English edition is Freeing the Spirit of Inquiry. And that's really what this book is about, and what I'm going to be talking about this evening. The science delusion is the belief that science has already explained all the most fundamental questions in principle, leaving the details to be filled in. Everyone agrees there's a lot we don't know, but the basic assumption of most working scientists, or at least when they're at work, is that science already knows the fundamental answers. And science as it's taught and practiced at the moment is based on 10 fundamental assumptions, which started off as working assumptions and which have hardened into dogmas. And most scientists aren't even aware that they're believing in dogmas. They just think this is the truth, or the way things are. Most scientists accept these dogmas not because they've thought about them, but because they haven't. And so what they are, I'll just enumerate them, and then I'll discuss several of them. I don't have time to discuss all 10 this evening. But the basic assumptions are, first, that nature is mechanical. The universe is like a machine. The earth is like a machine. Animals and plants are like machines, which is why we have machine metaphors for dealing with them: genetic engineering, factory farming, and so on. And we're machines as well. In Richard Dawkins' memorable phrase, we're lumbering robots. Our hearts are pumps, our brains are computers, and so on. So that's the first assumption. That was built into the foundations of science as we know it in the 17th century. The scientific revolution of the 17th century was revolutionary precisely because it switched from a metaphor in the Middle Ages of nature as an organism, Earth as Mother Earth, the whole universe as alive, to the idea that it's inanimate and mechanical. And that's what made science science as we now know it. So that's a very fundamental assumption. The second assumption is that this mechanical nature is made up of matter, and matter is unconscious. It has no mind, no consciousness, no purpose. It's entirely mechanical, pushed around by impersonal forces governed by mathematical laws of nature. The third assumption is that the so-called laws of nature are fixed. They've always been the same, they always will be the same. At the moment of the Big Bang, all the laws of nature were suddenly there, perfectly formed, and they've remained the same ever since, and so have the constants. That's why they're called constant. There's some debate about the constants, but very little debate about the laws. The fourth assumption is the total amount of matter and energy is always the same. It all suddenly came into being with the Big Bang. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle of give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the laws of nature and all the matter and energy in the universe from nothing in a single instant. The next assumption is that nature is purposeless. There's no purpose in evolution or in the entire cosmos. It's entirely without purpose, blindly pushed by energy in accordance with impersonal mathematical laws. And it has no purpose. Evolution is purposeless. We're here as a matter of chance and natural selection. There's no underlying purpose to human evolution or anything else. That is a consequence of the machine metaphor, the metaphor of the machine. Machines have no purposes of their own. They serve human purposes, but they don't in themselves have a purpose. The sixth assumption is that all biological inheritance is material. In genes or in epigenetic modifications of genes, everything we inherit is inherited materially, except, of course, for cultural inheritance. Everyone agrees that works in a different way. The seventh assumption is that memories are stored in brains. Everything you remember is somehow stored inside your head as modified nerve endings, modified chemicals, phosphorylated proteins, changed nucleic acids, or whatever. But it's material. Memory is material. And therefore, since memory is material and the brain is material, when you die, your brain decays, all your memories are wiped out. Therefore, any ideas about survival of bodily death, which all require some kind of memory, instantly dissolved as a kind of fantasy. So materialists are very keen on the idea that memories are material. It's an almost unquestioned assumption. The next assumption, number 8, is that your mind is nothing but your brain. Mental activity is brain activity. Minds are what brains do, to use the materialist slogan. It's all inside your head. I'll come back to this. The ninth assumption follows from the 8th, which is that psychic phenomena are illusory. Things like telepathy appear to occur. Many people believe they occur, but they can't really, because minds are inside brains and nothing more than that. Therefore, there's no way your intentions or thoughts could influence someone hundreds of miles away. Therefore, they're impossible. Therefore, they're illusory. Therefore, all the evidence for them has to be seen as discredited, flawed or fraudulent. And the 10th assumption is that mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. Our bodies are machines, therefore treating them physically by surgery or chemically with drugs are the only really valid forms of medicine. All these alternative and complementary therapies are basically quack therapies that only work through the placebo effect, if they work at all. And so that's the 10th assumption. Those are the basic assumptions that are the default worldview that comes installed in university graduates as part of their education. Most of them don't even realize that these are beliefs that they've absorbed, often implicitly, without being aware that these are all assumptions. And they have big effects. They affect the entire educational system. The whole scientific educational system takes these for granted. The educational system in general takes them for granted. They're the basis of the secular view of the world. And they affect public policy. For example, our Medical Research Council gives away nearly £1 billion a year of our money for medical research. How much goes to complementary and alternative medicine? The answer, none, because it's believed that the only valid kind of medicine and medical research is mechanistic. So these have enormous effects. Now, what I try to do in my book, The Science Delusion, is to turn these assumptions into hypotheses. Science is not a belief system, or it ought not to be. It's become a belief system for many people. This is the belief system of scientism, people who believe that science is the ultimate truth. But science is actually supposed to be about hypotheses and testing hypotheses. It's meant to be about evidence. It's a method. I'm totally in favor of science as a method. I'm not in favor of it as a dogmatic belief system. So what I do in my book is turn each of these 10 assumptions. Okay. I turn each of these 10 assumptions into a scientific question, a hypothesis, and then look at the evidence. Is nature mechanical? Is matter unconscious? Are the laws of nature fixed? Is the total amount of matter and energy always the same? And so on. And when we actually look at the scientific evidence for these assumptions, we find that, in fact, every single one of them turns out to be seriously questionable, if not actually wrong. And yet, these are the foundations of science as we know it. By questioning them, what happens is that huge new areas of potential scientific research open up, areas which are at present taboo because of this dogmatic belief system. Now, I don't have time to look at them all, but let me take one that seems the most firmly established in most people's mind, the one about matter and energy. Most people take it for granted that the total amount of matter and energy is fixed. And this is the basis for the traditional scientific taboo against perpetual motion machines. So it seems straightforward. You've learned it at school. It's part of standard chemistry. And it's defined in various ways. But most people take it for granted. To start with, these assumptions were theological. In ancient Greece, with the beginning of materialism, the atomist school of ancient Greece postulated that reality was made up of lots of little atoms which are indestructible. The atom means you can't split it. And because they're indestructible, the total number of atoms remained the same. Therefore, the total amount of matter was always the same. And in the 17th century, when atomism was revived within mechanistic science, that assumption got built in. So the total amount of matter was the same always, and the total amount of energy was the same. God was believed to have imparted a certain amount of motion to the universe at the beginning when he started off the world machine in the mechanistic version of theology. And because it was God-given, it was eternal and didn't change. This was enshrined in the laws of conservation of matter and energy in the 19th century. And has become one of the standard things about science that seems to be a certain truth. But physicists who make up the laws of nature are less constrained by them than most of us. And in the 1980s, people who were studying galaxies found that the galaxies weren't behaving as they ought to. These stars in the galaxies were revolving around the center far too fast, according to the amount of matter there should be in the galaxy. And galaxies were attracting each other too strongly to be explained in terms of the total amount of matter within them. If you add up all the matter within them, stars, planets, gas clouds, make generous assumptions for invisible stars and so on, there's not enough matter to explain the gravitational pull of one galaxy on another or of a galaxy on its outlying stars. So there was a terrible dilemma. What to do? Either the theories on which cosmology were based, Newtonian or Einsteinian relativity and gravitation, were wrong, or there was some organizing principle in galaxies over and above gravity that scientists had missed out. Or there must be a lot more mass that we couldn't see within the galaxies that could explain the missing gravitational effect. Well, the least disruptive assumption for scientists was that there was a lot more matter that we couldn't see, and because we can't see it, it was called dark matter. So they postulated that there was dark matter in the galaxies that would explain these phenomena. The distribution of dark matter could be adjusted for each galaxy to explain its shape and its behavior. How much dark matter did each one have? Well, the answer is simple. You just titrate in as much dark matter as you need to make the equations balance and explain the form of the galaxy. And that's the prevailing view. There are still minorities in science who think that there have to be other ways of thinking of galaxies or modifying gravitational theory, but the great majority take the view that dark matter is real. However, the problem with that is that there's not a shred of evidence for its existence. Despite billions of dollars being spent on dark matter detectors, underground pits full of fluids and so on, not a shred of evidence has emerged that it actually exists. The only evidence for it is that it makes the equations balance and enables the conventional theories of physics to survive any test, because you can add in more dark matter or subtract it as required to explain what you want to explain. It's basically an untestable theory. They've tried to test it, the tests have failed, but nobody's given up the theory because it fits the theories that they want to believe in. Now, this led to a serious problem, because having magnified the amount of energy in the universe by about 5-fold through dark matter, far more of it than regular matter, that meant the whole universe had far more gravitation than people had previously thought. And that would mean that the expansion of the universe, following the Big Bang, the expansion that's still going on, should be slowing down owing to all this extra matter within the universe. And in the 1990s, people thought that the universe would stop expanding, it would finally reach an ultimate limit, and then be pulled back together by all this matter in the universe gravitationally, until the whole thing ended in the opposite of the Big Bang, known in the trade as the Big Crunch. And the whole thing would end in tears. Well, that was the general view in the 1990s. But about 1999, observations of distant galaxies revealed that far from slowing down in their recession from us, they were speeding up. The universe was expanding faster and faster all the time, the exact opposite of the prediction of the dark matter theory. So, what to do? Well, again, you can't modify the fundamental assumptions because they're fixed. So, they did modify it in the sense that they said, well, there must be an extra form of energy pushing the universe apart. And we'll call that dark energy. And it's dark energy because it's undetectable by anything other than its effects, namely pushing the universe apart faster and faster. The problem is, this has now led to a tremendous problem for the principle of conservation of matter and energy, because the main theory of dark energy is that the density of dark energy is uniform throughout the universe and remains uniform. But since the universe is getting bigger, that means there must be more of it. So the universe is now a perpetual motion machine. It's actually creating energy as it expands. So, is the law of conservation of matter and energy valid? Physicists have made up matter and energy in the last 20 or 30 years till they made up matter and energy. Dark matter and energy is now 95% of reality. Can it be converted into regular matter? Could some matter suddenly appear in this room as a result of being transformed from dark matter or dark energy? Well, nobody knows, because no one knows anything about dark matter and dark energy. So we're left with this it's as if physics has discovered the cosmic unconscious. 95% of reality is utterly unknown to us, and yet it's pervading this room. And we don't know what it does, how it interacts. Then the question arises, well, what about all these people with so-called above unity devices? There are inventors, lots of them out there, who've got gadgets they say produce more energy than you put in. The minute they put these to a standard investment company or venture capital company, they phone up a local professor of physics and they say, oh, don't touch it with a barge pole, obvious cranks, you know, it's another perpetual motion machine thing. The fact is, physics now says that in addition to dark matter, the whole universe floats on an ocean of dark energy, of the quantum vacuum field, which is full of energy. What the matter we know is like waves on the top of a vast ocean. Some of these people claim they're tapping this vast ocean of energy and getting more energy than they're putting in. I've seen some of these devices myself. I actually think they're right. I don't know how they work, but I think these things are possible. And yet, you'd never get a grant from any official funding agency for this research, because it's instantly scorned as being impossible. And here dogmatism kicks in and is actually preventing research in an area that could be of vast importance to the world. If it's possible to get energy from, as it were, nothing, that would obviously transform the economy and the whole global crisis, in environmental crisis. So, is the total amount of matter and energy always the same? Well, it's not as simple as you learned in A-level physics. If you did A-level physics or at GCSE or O-level. There's vastly more complicated, and this dogma does look awfully naive and outdated. Now let me move on to some of the other questions. Let me move on to the question of the mind being none other than the brain. this is a very fundamental assumption of the mechanistic materialist worldview. And it's the belief system of those who are committed to mechanistic atheism or materialism, which says that consciousness is basically confined to brains. The entire universe is essentially unconscious or non-conscious, except for human brains and the brains of higher animals and possibly lower animals as well to a lesser degree. But consciousness is just not out there in the universe. It's confined to brains and it's inside heads. That's a very familiar view. Some of you may have grown up with that view, some of you may believe it, some of you will certainly know people, all of you will know people who do believe it. It's the default worldview, as I say, of the university graduate. Why do people believe this so strongly? Well, partly the historical background I have to deal with, because you can't really understand this doctrine. It's not based on evidence, because there's nobody who's ever seen consciousness confined to the inside of a head. It's a theoretical assumption. And the background to it is that in the Middle Ages, it was generally assumed by everybody that there were many forms of consciousness. There was, first of all, the consciousness of God, first and foremost, divine consciousness. God is a conscious being, and divine consciousness underlay and pervaded all things, pervaded the entire universe, and was the ultimate source of all things. Then there were a whole range of other kinds of consciousness beyond the human level, mainly angels, spirits, and principally angels, and also the spirits of the departed, and particularly those of saints, who are a particular category of the departed, who were not only existent but could interact with humans. And then there were humans, and then all the animals and plants had souls which were largely unconscious. A medieval teaching following St. Thomas Aquinas, who was much influenced by Aristotle, was that all nature's alive and all living beings have souls. The souls of plants shape the plant. They give the plant its form. Animals have vegetative souls which shape their bodies and maintain them and help them repair after injury or disease. Animals also have the animal soul, which gives instincts, emotions, coordinates the senses and the activities of the animal and underlies the instincts. And of course the word animal comes from the Latin word for soul, anima. And this was the standard view in the Middle Ages. Animals have souls, that's why they're called beings with souls. And humans have vegetative souls like plants that shape the growing body in the embryo and as we grow. We have animal souls that give us our animal instincts, emotions, our animal senses, our animal natures. And in addition, we have the rational or the intellectual soul, which is to do with language, reason, thought, consciousness. And that was the view of humans and of nature in the Middle Ages, against which the mechanistic revolution in science rebelled. How it rebelled, as I've already mentioned briefly, was by eliminating the level of the soul, by saying that animals and plants and nature and stars and planets are not living beings with intelligences and minds and consciousness. They're dead mechanisms, inanimate mechanisms. The souls of animals and plants were drained out of nature, the soul of the earth, the souls of the planets, the intelligences of the stars, which were thought to be angelic minds, were drained out of nature. So what was left was inanimate machinery governed by mathematical laws. And the soul was drained out of the human body as well. So the body just became a mechanism. The only thing left was the rational mind. And that set humans apart from all other animals, because they didn't have them, and set the mind and the body apart from each other. This was so-called Cartesian dualism after Descartes, who was the first proponent of this view. It also created a split between science and religion. Science got the whole universe, and religion got the human mind and angels and God and morality. And this split enabled the two to lead a more or less peaceful coexistence for several hundred years. But in the 19th century, increasing numbers of materialists wanted to advocate an atheist point of view, because that greatly weakened the power of churches and governments that were sustained by traditional churches, like the governments of France and Russia. So partly for political reasons, materialism became a favoured option. What materialism does is takes Cartesian dualism, which has spirit and matter, and says there's no such thing as spirit. God and angels simply don't exist, and human consciousness is nothing but the activity of the material brain. So that's how materialism gets to this view that the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain, largely through a philosophical development rather than scientific evidence. It then becomes a matter of deep commitment for many people to maintain this worldview. So, but the question then remains, well, is it true? Is our consciousness confined to our heads? This is not a question you can ask if you're a committed materialist, which is why psychic phenomena are completely taboo, and why materialists get incredibly angry at the idea that telepathy might exist. I did a lot of experiments. I take the view that if it exists, it's biological and natural, normal, not paranormal, and natural, not supernatural. So when I first got interested in this in the 1990s, I started looking at telepathy in animals, and soon found that there were enormous amount of evidence for dogs and cats and other animals having telepathic abilities. I wrote a whole book about this called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, which is about dogs that know when their owners are coming home. Also cats and other animals, and also other telepathic and premonition abilities and premonitions in animals. Well, these things, for most people, they're not a stretch. Most people have had telepathic experiences. Most people have had psychic experiences. But as soon as you step into a scientific institution, then you're meant to poo-poo these things and say, oh, it's impossible, it's rubbish, it's nonsense, and so forth. Not a very scientific attitude. So anyway, that's the taboo in action. It's the taboo to defend this view that the mind's nothing but the brain. And this has become a massive problem within science. It's called the hard problem in the philosophy of mind, because how you can explain the emergence of consciousness from totally non-conscious matter is virtually impossible. So that's why it's called the hard problem. I'll come back to that in a moment. But meanwhile, the idea it's all inside the head is, I think, deeply questionable. This idea was formed when people thought matter was just stuff that was localized. We now, since the 19th century, have had a totally different view of matter. Matter is associated with extended fields. Fields extend beyond material objects. The field of a magnet extends beyond the magnet. It's within the magnet and extends beyond it. The gravitational field of the Earth is in the Earth, but extends invisibly beyond it. It holds the moon in its orbit. The moon affects the tides here on Earth. We're all affected by it right now, which is why we're not floating around in this room, why we're all anchored to the floor. It's an invisible field. And then your mobile telephone, currently switched off, of course, has invisible fields that stretch out beyond it. It's an electromagnetic device. It has electromagnetic processes within it. But those extend far beyond it invisibly, which is why the mobile phone works. In fact, in the current view of matter within science, matter is seen as vibrations of activity within fields. An electron is an energetic vibration within an electron field. A proton is a vibration within a proton field. Matter is explained in fields rather than in terms of fields rather than fields in terms of matter. So extended fields are the very basis of modern science, and modern science is in the business of explaining the visible in terms of the invisible, these invisible fields that underlie everything. including the tiniest particles of matter. Now, what I'm suggesting is that our minds are field-like. They are rooted in our brains normally during waking life, but they extend beyond them through fields, just as the fields of your mobile phone extend invisibly beyond your mobile phone. And that our minds may be much more extensive than our brains. I'm suggesting the same for animal minds. This is not a spiritual argument, it's an argument about the nature of minds, human and non-human. The easiest way to see what I'm talking about is to think about the nature of vision. And I'm now talking about regular vision, not visionary activities as in William Blake. I'm talking about the simple fact that you can see me standing here and that I can see you. Now, what's going on in vision? The standard view is simple and straightforward. Light is reflected from me, travels through the electromagnetic field as invisible light rays, enters your eyes, inverted images form on the retinas of both eyes, impulses travel up the optic nerve, and a series of electrochemical changes happen within the optical cortex and other parts of your brain. That's been understood, or at least described, in greater detail than ever before, thanks to modern brain scanning techniques. But does that explain vision? Well, no. It describes what's happening in your eyes and your brain when you're seeing something. It doesn't explain vision. First of all, it doesn't explain why you're conscious of what you see. That's an example of the hard problem. The hard problem is to explain consciousness at all. It ought not to exist if the universe consists exclusively of non-conscious matter. But the second problem is, where are the images you're experiencing located? You're seeing me, I imagine, in full color in 3D, located where I'm standing here. But the official view is that your image of me is a small virtual reality, three-dimensional virtual reality display located inside your head. You have an internal representation in 3 dimensions in full color in your head. If you look at the sky you see is inside your head. And one philosopher of mind asked a provocative question in a scientific journal dealing with this point, saying, is your skull beyond the sky? Because the official view says when you look at the sky, that experience is inside your head. Everything is inside your head that you experience. You've got a small virtual head inside your head, but everything else beyond there is also inside your head. It's all inside the brain. That's the official view, taken to its logical conclusion. Nobody really believes that. Even die-hard materialists, I mean, when they're off duty, don't really believe this, because our most immediate experience is that images are outside our heads. And what I'm suggesting is the totally radical view, so simple that it's hard to understand, that your image of me is located right here, exactly where it seems to be. It's in your mind, but it's not inside your brain. It's constructed by your mind, it's interpreted by your mind, but it's located where it seems to be. That vision, in other words, I'm suggesting, involves a two-way process. Light comes in, changes happen in the brain, and the images we see are projected out to where they seem to be. And the whole world that we are seeing is projected out in our perceptual fields, which are part of our mental fields, all around us, into the world around us. And birds and animals and dogs and cats are doing the same thing. This is not special to humans. Now, this is not a new theory. I claim no credit for it. It's what Plato believed. It's what most ancient Greeks believed. It's what people all over the world believe in all traditional cultures. And it's what children under the age of 10 or 11 believe in our own society. The psychologist Jean Piaget studied the children's conception of the world, and he showed until the age of 10 or 11, children believe that vision involves projecting out images to where they're seeing things. That's why Superman comics show rays going out of Superman's eyes, and also why Roald Dahl's story Matilda is so popular, because Matilda has eye beams that can move things around, and children love this. That's how they think vision works. But as Piaget says, by the age of 10 or 11, the average child learns the correct view, which is that thoughts and images are invisible things located inside heads. So we've all been brought up with the correct view, even though we've never had a shred of evidence for it. It's an assumption based on this materialist theory of the mind. Now, Euclid, also the great geometer, was the first person to apply this as an explanatory theory to explain how mirrors work. And Euclid pointed out that the light comes into our eyes, but when we project out the images, since the images we're projecting out are mental rather than physical, they go straight through things, so they go through a mirror, and we see the images we're projecting behind the mirror, which is why every time you look in a mirror, you're seeing images. You're actually seeing your projections every time you look in a mirror. And funnily enough, although this is so radically different from the official view, it is what actually appears in physics textbooks. There's no other explanation for it. In physics textbooks, you have little dotted lines going to a virtual image behind a mirror. And it says the image is projected back to the point X where the virtual image is located. They don't explain how this projection back works. It's treated as a purely geometrical proposition. Well, I'm suggesting that that's how vision works, just as Euclid thought. And moreover, I'm suggesting this can be tested. If our minds reach out, in a sense, to touch what we're looking at, if I look at you and my image of you coincides with where you are, my mental image may coincide with your body image, and you may be able to feel my looking at you. So it could be testable. It led to the radical prediction that people might be able to feel when they're being looked at from behind. And as soon as I realized that was a prediction of the theory, I realized it wasn't just a wild prediction, it's an actual fact. Most people have had, 90% or more of the population have had the experience of turning around because someone's looking at them, or looking at someone else who then turns round. Surveys show this is common in all age groups, including children. Most people just take it for granted, the feeling of being stared at. Now, the skeptics, of course, defending the materialist worldview, the so-called skeptics, have got a ready answer. Well, you look round all the time, and if no one's looking at you, you just forget about it. And if they are looking at you, you imagine there's some mysterious influence. And similarly, you look at other people from behind all the time, and if one of them turns around, you think it's some mysterious influence, but you forget all the millions of times you're wrong. That's their standard view. But that's all right, it's a hypothesis, it can be tested. So I decided to try and test this. The first thing I did was looked at the natural history. I interviewed security guards, private detectives, long lens photographers, and other people whose job it is to watch others. Most of us are mere amateurs, but some people are actually paid to watch other people. And if you go on a private detective training course, I'm assuming that most of you haven't, so I can let you into one of their secrets, which is that when you're being trained how to shadow somebody, how to follow them, you're trained don't stare at their back, because if you do, they'll feel you looking at them, they'll turn around, catch your eye, and your cover's blown. You have to look at them a little bit, otherwise you lose them, but you look at their feet, occasionally as little as possible. In the SAS, when people are being trained how to creep up behind someone and stab them in the back, they're told don't stare at their back, because they're likely to feel you and turn around and shoot you first. These are practical people. I mean, if some professor comes along and says, oh, it's all make-believe, don't take any notice, the mind's nothing but the brain, they're not going to listen to you. They're more interested in saving their lives than some academic materialist theory. In the martial arts, they have training procedures to become more sensitive to being looked at from behind, because this is a useful thing, to know if someone's looking at you from behind and preparing to attack you. Now, so there's a great deal of evidence this really happens, and people in the surveillance business, almost all, just take it for granted. These store detectives at Harrods, for example, had no doubt about this. They just said, you know, of course, you know, everyone knows this. Then you need experimental tests. And I developed a very simple test, so simple a child could do it. And in fact, tens of thousands of tests have already been done and thousands of children have already taken part. This has been done in the school system in Britain, Connecticut, USA, and in Germany. In these tests, the subject is blindfolded, the other person sits behind them, and in a randomized series of trials, either look at the back of their neck or look away and think of something else. And each trial is signaled by a bleep or a click. And when the subject hears that, within 10 seconds they have to guess if they're being looked at or not. And they're right or wrong. By chance, they'd be right about 50% of the time. There's been at least 100,000 of these trials so far. The average hit rate is not much above chance, it's 55%, but it's very, very significant statistically because it's enormously, with that large number, it becomes highly significant. These tests are very artificial. People feel self-conscious. It doesn't work as well as in real life, but by the standards used in science, this is pretty conclusive. The evidence on which statins and aspirin for heart attacks and that kind of thing are based is weaker than this. And yet billions of dollars are spent every year on these drugs on the basis of much smaller effects. So there's evidence from that. There are also some people are much better than others. Some people are spectacularly good at this. Young children are the best. And in Amsterdam, in the Science Museum, this test has been running for 20 years now. It's one of the biggest experiments ever conducted. And they've shown that by their star subjects are nearly all children under the age of 9. Young children are more sensitive. I think most of us become somewhat inured to this. We're living in cities and lots of people seeing us all the time. Anyway, the belief that this is real is supported by the evidence. These tests have also been done through one-way mirrors, even through closed-circuit television. Surprisingly, it even works through closed-circuit television. There's now a substantial scientific literature on this. At first, when I got interested in this, I found that some scientists refused to take it seriously, and I said, why? And they said, well, it can't be real, it hasn't got a scientific name. So I said, okay, well, would you like to suggest one? So we had classics masters at various schools in North London working on names and various Cambridge dons. We had a kind of contest for the best scientific name, and the one that won is scopaesthesia. Scop as in microscope, looking, aesthesia as in synesthesia, anesthesia, feeling the looks. So it's now called scopaesthesia. It turns out that many animals are very sensitive scopaesthesically, more so than people. And I think this ability is very basic, fundamental in the whole animal world, some more than others, but I think it would have been favoured by natural selection. If a if a prey animal could feel when a hidden predator was watching it, it would tend to escape better than if it couldn't feel. And so I think natural selection has worked in favour of this over long periods. And something as simple and as well known universally as the sense of being stared at turns out as a real phenomenon to just demolish the materialist theory of mind, that it's all inside the brain. It can't be if this phenomenon's real, which is why materialists get so angry if you even investigate, they even talk about investigating this, because it cannot possibly be true. It's not taught in any psychology course or in any university because it's airbrushed out of the entire picture. It doesn't fit this worldview. Now, let me come very briefly to the final point I'll be able to discuss this evening, the dogma that all matter is unconscious. This started off with an assumption by René Descartes in his philosophy. He defined matter as unconscious and defined the spiritual realm as consisting of God, angels, and human minds. So he split consciousness off from the whole of nature, and minds, even unconscious minds, split off from nature to give purely unconscious matter and pure disembodied consciousness on the other hand. That was the basis of his split. In the 19th century, as I mentioned, materialists didn't like this split. I don't like it either, but, and I'm not a materialist, but their way of dealing with it was to get rid of the spirit and end up with just matter. But then they have the hard problem of human consciousness. Why should we be conscious if matter is completely unconscious with not a shred of consciousness in it? And materialist philosophers over the last 70 or 80 years, who occupy some of the most prestigious chairs in our major universities, have attempted various ways of getting around this. One argument is to say, actually, we're not conscious. Consciousness doesn't exist. That's called eliminative materialism. Of course, they make their arguments in normal language. People listen to them in normal lectures or read them in normal books through their consciousness. But their argument is it doesn't really exist, and soon neuroscience will enable us to dispense with the last remnants of what they call folk psychology, the belief that there are subjective inner states that do something. The second school is the epiphenomenalist school that says consciousness is nothing but a meaningless epiphenomenon that goes on around your brain, but doesn't do anything. You have no free will. None of these theories allow for free will. It's an epiphenomenon. It doesn't do anything like a shadow. It's just around the activity of the brain. And the third school of thought says that consciousness does exist, but it's an illusion. It doesn't do anything. It's totally illusory. All the hard work is done by the physical mechanisms of the brain, and consciousness is a kind of illusion created by the brain, but doesn't do anything. That's a popular theory, that consciousness is an illusion. But the problem is it doesn't dissolve the problem, you see, because illusion is itself a mode of consciousness. So materialist philosophers go around attacking each other for these implausible theories, and they've been doing this for decades and getting nowhere. And now they're jumping ship. It started about 15 years ago with Galen Strawson, a British philosopher working in America, who wrote a key paper called Does Materialism Imply Panpsychism? Panpsychism is the doctrine that psyche or mind is everywhere. Pan means everywhere. And he proposed the only way out was to suppose there's some level of consciousness, however small or low, in an electron, an atom, in molecules. And that if there's some kind of low levels of consciousness all through the atomic and subatomic realms, and then as more and more complex aggregates of matter come into being, more and more complex forms of consciousness can emerge, as in our own case. And at first this was attacked savagely by the materialists. But then in 2013, the top philosopher of mind in the US, Thomas Nagel, went over to panpsychism. He wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. It was greeted with a sort of vast furore and enormous personal attacks by the leading materialists. The New York Review of Books went apoplectic with attacks on him for putting forward this view. But then Christoph Koch, who's one of the leading neuroscientists, he worked with Francis Crick, who's hardcore, a reductionist as you could get, went over to panpsychism a couple of years ago. And it's now becoming increasingly respectable among neuroscientists as well as among philosophers of mind. We're in the middle of a sea change at the moment, and this is a most interesting development. Now, of course, they're still confining this to micro-panpsychism, electrons and atoms, but it opens the way to a much wider discussion. If all self-organizing systems potentially have a mind or mental activity of some kind, it should apply to large things instead as well as small. The whole Earth, Gaia, may not only be alive but conscious. And then what about the sun? The sun has far more complex electromagnetic patterns of activity than our brains. The electromagnetism seems to be the interface between mind and brain. Why shouldn't the sun be conscious? All traditional peoples have thought the sun was conscious. It was a god or a goddess, depending on the belief system, the mythological system. And why should we not think of the sun as conscious again? And if the sun's conscious, then so would be all the other stars. If the stars have minds, what about the galactic mind? The whole galaxy may have a mind. The galaxy may be like an organism. The stars and solar systems like cells within the organism of the galaxy. And it may have an organizing principle that keeps the stars and everything in place. The idea it's all got to be done by gravity, by titrating in dark matter, may be a complete misconception of the way things really are. And this is not too great a stretch. This is now all on the intellectual agenda. And of course, if galaxies are conscious, what about the entire cosmos? The entire cosmos may have a mind, a cosmic mind, which is, after all, what all traditional or most traditional societies have thought. And if there's a conscious mind of the cosmos, there may be a mind that transcends it as well. Just as our minds are not just about our bodies, where they are and what they're doing, but they can transcend our bodies to think about the cosmos. They can transcend the immediate circumstances. It may be the cosmic mind can do that too. Then we're in a realm which is much more familiar to all traditions of religion and mythology and shamanism and so on. What makes materialistic atheism different from all religions, all shamanic traditions, is that all those traditions assume there are forms of consciousness higher than our own that we can make contact with through mystical experiences and spiritual practices. Materialism, atheistic materialism, assumes there's no forms of consciousness out there greater than our own. It's all inside our brain, and there's nothing out there. And that makes it radically different from all these traditional views. But since the scientific world is now moving under its own dynamics for its own scientific reasons towards a panpsychist view, I think we're entering a completely different terrain. In my most recent books, Science and Spiritual Practices, and the most recent one came out in January, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, I discuss in each book 7 different spiritual practices, including meditation, singing and chanting, psychedelics, prayer, holy days and festivals, rituals, sports, a whole range of ways in which people enter altered states of consciousness. And in all these different practices have in common the feeling they give that our minds are part of something greater than ourselves. And all spiritual practices create, in one way or another, that experience. Traditional religions say, yes, that's because there really are our minds greater than our own that we're making contact with. Materialists say, no, it's perfectly possible to meditate, and what's going on in meditation, all those cosmic feelings are nothing but products of my own brain due to dopamine release or other neurotransmitters. So many atheists and materialists do now meditate. The interesting debate is not about one lot of people totally against spiritual practices and the other lot spiritual and religious. We now have spiritual practices are being adopted because they work and because they make people happier, healthier, and live longer by people, even if they have a materialist and atheist worldview. So the frontier of the atheist, non-atheist debate has become much more nuanced and interesting than it used to be. Anyway, I discuss this in my most recent books. But I think what we're doing at the moment is entering a period when these fundamental questions, all 10 of these fundamental questions, are up for grabs. All 10 of these assumptions are questionable, if to say the least, and I think actually all of them are actually false, or at best half-truths. And when we dissolve these areas of these dogmatic boundaries, the potential for scientific research to explore new areas becomes enormous. I mean, just to take a relatively trivial example, if the sense of being stared at is indeed real, as I think it is, then it becomes an interesting question for ecologists and for animal behaviorists to look at what happens under field conditions with predators and prey. What happens with mice when cats are trying to catch them? Do they feel the stare? How do cats avoid the mice always picking up when they're staring at them? Maybe they do it by having a fixed stare, so they habituate to it and cease being scared of it and then get killed. These dynamics, ecological dynamics, have not been investigated because you wouldn't get a job to do this, you wouldn't get a grant, and in fact you'd be thrown out of almost any university if you did this kind of research at the moment. There's an extraordinary intolerance that goes with this dogmatic worldview. So what I'm arguing for is a more pluralistic approach to science, not ruling out whole areas of inquiry on the grounds they don't fit with this doctrine, but saying, okay, let 100 flowers bloom, let people examine different forms of medical therapy scientifically, let people examine all these unexplained phenomena scientifically. Let people look at alternative energy sources scientifically, instead of trying to freeze them all out and marginalize them and expel them from the halls of science. And I think that if we do that, I think scientific research would become much more interesting. I think it would become much more fun. And I think it would also become a great deal cheaper. So I think we stand on the threshold of an actually major shift in paradigm or model of reality. This doesn't mean we abandon all the great findings and discoveries of science so far. We don't. But we put them within a larger framework of thought so that they cease to be treated as the only way to truth and become part of a larger and more inclusive picture of reality, which I think will be more life-affirming and enable us to live in greater harmony with this planet rather than the alienated way we've been living in a mechanistic frame of mind. So I think we're on the threshold of a very exciting period. Thank you.